Thank you to EA for sponsoring this video. What if you took like the Call of Duty AAA gameplay experience, but made it about spell slinging in a fantasy world? Imagine if instead of a helicopter flying overhead, there was a dragon, and instead of RPG shells hitting a wall, there were fireballs that was cast from a battle mage. And what if you were playing as that battle mage? Well, those are the exact thoughts that were the motivating factor that kicked off the development for Immortals of Aveum. This is a brand new single-player magic focused FPS. The game is set in a fantasy world with elements of sci-fi and features a roughly 25-hour story-driven campaign with levels that are designed to focus on the moment-to-moment gameplay while still offering a bit of exploration, puzzle solving, and Metroidvania-like elements. The game is being developed by Ascendant, a new studio helmed by Brett Robbins, former game director for both Dead Space and Call of Duty. And despite that original pitch, they have come out and stated that they aren't just fantasy COD due to the game having a bigger focus on both its narrative and the exploration. In fact, from what I've seen of the game, it feels almost more reminiscent to something like Doom than Call of Duty, and I mainly say that due to the game's pacing and the movement in it, just how the gameplay looks and feels. So EA recently reached out asking to sponsor a video in which I took a close look at the game, and that is what I've done. I got to sit down, see some early gameplay in action, as well as speak with developers in an exclusive interview in which they shared some more granular details and specifics. And with that, let's talk about what I saw and talk about what Immortals of Aveum is. Now again, this is a narrative single-player focused game, so story is a big part of it. I don't want to spoil or go into too much detail, but the general gist is you are playing as this elite magical soldier known as an Unforeseen. There's a big bad guy called Sandrak who is threatening to destroy your home of Lucium, and then with the help of the Immortals, you all must work together to fight back his army and save the kingdom. Now I asked about the general game structure, like what does the game look like when you play it? How is it broken up? Is it mostly linear? Is it semi-open, open world? And the answer is it's a story-driven, chapter-based game. So you're gonna start in chapter 1, play your way through, and progress to chapter 2 with having the option to go back to chapter 1. So the general play space, there's what they call like semi-open corridors. So you're gonna have some more narrow areas, more feeling like a traditional corridor shooter, but then some spots that are semi-open, which have a bit of exploration. And then those Metroidvania stuff. So as you move through your space, you'll come across some enemies, you'll fight them, and then maybe you'll find an area that you can't quite reach, or a gap you can't cross, or a door you can't open. And then later, you will find the means of progressing, like a new key or a new ability. They'll let you then come back and get past whatever that obstacle was. There is also going to be some light puzzle solving in the game. In fact, we saw that in their most recent gameplay trailer, where the player found this item that they could use to fire a special beam. Putting that through a relic split the beam in two. At that point, the player had to reposition themselves to try to line that split beam up with these two statues, and then doing so successfully ended up summoning a boss fight. So it's probably best to think of this as a mostly linear game with some side spots that you could go through, some different elevations, some branching paths here and there. But you move through the first chapter, you get to the second chapter, some Metroidvania stuff might pull you back here and there. And while there is puzzle solving and some traversal that takes place, for the most part, you will be engaged in the combat. That's the core focus of the actual gameplay part of this game. So let's talk about that. As discussed, it is a first-person action spell slinger where magic spells act as sort of their FPS counterparts. So you're gonna have spells that function like weapons, like rifles, SMGs, shotguns, along with a wide range of other offensive, defensive, and utility abilities. There's a total of 25 spells in the game, and these are actually broken into a few distinct categories. First, there are the spell types, and these are Strike, Fury, Control, and Dominion. So strikes are like your basic attacks. This is what you're going to be spamming. Think of this as your primary weapon. It's what you'll be using throughout most of the fight, and these are only limited by the size of your clip. So depending on the particular strike that you're using, it'll have different damage type, different effective range, and a different amount of ammo essentially before you have to reload. The Fury spells are stronger than strikes, but they are not spammable as they come with a cooldown and mana cost. Control spells, as they sound, around are various types of spells that are used to manipulate your enemies. Now, beyond those, spells are also broken up into 3 different colors: red, blue, and green. And it's best to think of these sort of like different elements. In fact, they've got their own names. Blue is force, red is chaos, and green is life. Now, enemies in the game will have these powerful shields associated with these colors, and which, in order to break through, you have to match the color type. So red magic will break through red shields, etc. And then some enemies will be immune to certain colors of magic. You'll figure this out while you're fighting them. You hit them with a red spell, it says immune. You're going to need to swap to green or blue. So every single one of those 25 spells that you have at your disposal will have variations of each color type. So there are blue, red, and green versions of strike, fury, control, and then what ones you choose are going to depend on a wide range of things, whatever your preferred play style is, or whatever particular encounter or boss that you're up against, which will determine what would be best to use in that situation. So just as some examples, here are 3 different strike spells. There's a blue strike called Arc Light Strike Bolt, which is like semi-automatic fire, long range, and precise. A red strike called Frag Fire, which is short range, high damage, large spread, area of effect. And then a green strike Maelstrom Storm Shards is rapid fire and homing. And similarly, every single type will have multiple colors, and they kind of fit the theming of each of these elements, more or less. There's also going to be plenty of movement abilities in the game. You'll have access to a dash, a double jump, and even the ability to hover in the air. Some of this will be part of your base kit. Others will have to be unlocked over time through playing and progressing. And many of these can be enhanced. Like, for example, you can increase the number of dashes you have at your disposal. They also have a grapple hook in the game, letting you tether to certain points in the environment and pull yourself around. This was on display quite frequently in that recent gameplay trailer, as well as defensive skills. Like, you've got this shield spell. You can bring up a shield that provides you with cover. It is super defensive, but it has a set amount of health, so it'll eventually break. And then also, while you have it up, it slows you down. So it's one of those things where you can choose these more defensive things like the shield, or you could get a ton of dashes. So instead of holding up a shield, you could dash around enemies and get behind cover or get behind them. And while we haven't actually seen it directly, I just asked about the combat HUD, and they were happy to oblige. So they said that while not displayed in the gameplay trailer, primarily just for cinematic effect, there is a HUD. There will be a directional compass pointing you around, a center reticle for aiming, and this actually shows the clip information for your strike spells, or how many shots you have left until you have to reload. And this is more or less the game's pacing mechanism for breaks to do other things like dodge, block, or cast fury spells while reloading. In the bottom right, it will show your mana for the fury spells. There is a mana cost, and the mana will refill. Also, as mentioned earlier, fury spells will have some sort of cooldown associated with them. And then in the lower left hand, this is where your control spells are displayed, and you can cycle through these apparently on the fly. Now, from what we've seen, from everything that I've seen of the game and from the recent trailer they released, the actual gameplay itself, like what you're doing while you're playing this game, it's primarily going to be focused on the combat. But as mentioned earlier, there are some elements. There will be some traversal stuff. There are those Metroidvania things, and then tied into that are some of the puzzle solving that's going to take place. You'll go through big groups of enemies with fighting different types of enemies with different shields, different strengths, different attacks, mini bosses and boss fights, all of that stuff. But then there is also gear. So let's talk about the loot in this game. So gear is broken up into 4 categories. There are sigils, totems, rings, and bracers. Sigils are essentially your basic weapon. These come in multiple forms, like wands, for example, and primarily make your magic more powerful. So you're going to find different sigils that alter your spells or unlock new variants. In fact, in the gameplay they just released, we saw the player cycle through a few different sigils. Each one of them had a different damage, speed, and capacity, as well as some secondary effects that did things like increasing certain color magic power, or increasing fury damage, or reducing mana cost, etc. Rings are used to further enhance and change your spells in a variety of additional ways. Totems are said to affect the abilities of your magical equipment and spells, and then bracers affect the passive abilities of your character stats. Now, all of this loot you're just going to find while playing. In that recent gameplay trailer, we in fact saw the player collect a purple piece of gear after defeating what looked to be a boss or a mini boss. And all of the loot is predetermined. They are pre-placed, they have a specific name and particular stats. Nothing is randomized. So all this gear comes from very particular spots, very particular locations as you play. Some of the gear will just be raw power increases, otherwise known as stat sticks. Others will be ability modifying. So as an example, they said that the game's shatter spell, which kind of throws spikes along the ground that detonate on impact, there's a piece of gear in the game that will then take that spell and turn it into 3 separate projectiles, making it quite different. Although the game does have gear, they made sure to note that this isn't a looter shooter by any means, and gear is just meant as one form of progression as you move your way through the game. Outside of the gear, the game also has progression via a skill tree. There is one tree basically for each school or each color of magic, with a total of 80 different talents to choose from. It's worth noting though, you can't unlock everything, so this is going to have you specialize if there's a certain color or a certain type, like strike attacks or whatever, that you want to focus on in the different trees in one tree. That is going to be an option. It's what you're going to have to do, because you will not get enough skill points while playing to unlock every single talent that is in the skill tree. And if you want to play around with different things, respecking is said to be pretty easy. There'll just be a respec button right there at the forefront in the menu. So we've got this concept of like Call of Duty, but in a fantasy magic world with gameplay that feels the pacing and just the general look and feel of it, very reminiscent of a game like Doom. I don't know if I mentioned this yet, but they have said that the rough ballpark of playing through this game is going to be somewhere around 25 hours of playtime, obviously more or less depending on play style, player skill, all of that. The game has difficulty modes as well. There will be an easy, medium, and hard. I asked how they distinguish between the difficulties, so there will be the base level of scaling damage and health of enemies, but then I was also told that they're going to be scaling the AI to be more aggressive as you progress into the harder tier difficulty. Now, in terms of what to do after, like if there was any end game or replayability to the game, I was told that there is post-credits content, although they are keeping exactly what that is under wraps. Specifically, I was told that there's no new game plus per se, but there will be reasons to go back and revisit chapters that you've already played through, as things will be different and or change after you get to the end of the story. So a little bit unclear as to exactly what that is. Maybe they're just trying to keep the surprise. That is my assumption at the moment. So when is this game going to be coming out? Well, currently it is set to release on Thursday, July 20th. It's coming to PC, PlayStation 5, as well as Xbox Series X and S, so it is a current gen. And also, if you go to the game's FAQ, one notable thing of mention here is when asked if there's going to be any microtransactions or paid elements in the game, the response was no, that is not going to be present at all. In terms of whether or not they're going to do any DLC, the response was they are just focused on making the best game possible for release, so presumably maybe that's something they consider down the road depending on how everything pans out. But that is basically it. That is a sort of an overview of Immortals of Aveum. We got a story-driven magic spell slinging game, gonna last roughly 25 hours, chapter-based with some replayability, some exploration here and there, some of those Metroidvania-like elements. I'm liking what I'm seeing so far. Hopefully you guys found this video helpful and useful. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take it easy.